The Tether. Elmwood House had been abandoned for decades. Locals avoided it as one avoids the dying, out of fear, discomfort, and an unspoken understanding that something sinister resided there. Tales swirled around the house like vultures over a corpse. Families who moved in, but they never left. Their belongings decaying inside. Strange lights in the upstairs window, and the faint sound of wailing that sometimes carried on the wind. Michael Cain, a man hardened by loss and skeptical of superstition, dismissed these rumors. He was looking for a fresh start after the death of his wife Clara, and the house seemed like a perfect project to occupy his hands and his mind. The real estate agent hadn't warned him about the house's history, but the neighbors had been less shy.
"You'll regret it,"
said Mrs. Andrews from 2 doors down. Her sunken eyes and nicotine-stained fingers trembled as she spoke.
"Everyone does."
Michael only nodded politely and continued unpacking his tools. Discovery. The first 2 days were uneventful, filled with the ordinary grind of clearing cobwebs, scrubbing mildew, and repairing the structural damage of neglect. Michael had his usual Spotify playlist on, a blend of Snoop Dogg, Nate Dogg, Monsters of Men, and George Benson. It was the playlist he always listened to while renovating, the one that refueled him with energy. He knew all the lyrics by heart, and it really helped the hours fly by. The house groaned under his weight as though protesting his intrusion, but Michael chalked it up to settling wood and his imagination. On the 3rd day, while prying up warped, moldy floorboards in the upstairs bedroom, using a hunting knife he had just unstrapped from his belt, Michael stumbled upon something unexpected. A box. It was a small, scorched chest, buried beneath layers of rotted wood and damp insulation. Intricate carvings covered its surface, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under the dim light. Michael wiped his eyes and brought the box under the light for a better look. He ran his fingers over the etchings, their texture sharp and unpleasant like dried scabs. The box resisted his efforts to open it until he pried it loose with his knife. And inside the box was a book. Its leather cover was brittle, and the pages reeked of something foul, a mix of iron and sulfur and rot. The writing inside was chaotic, most of it in a jagged, spidery script that Michael couldn't understand, but one phrase leapt out, written in deep red ink that almost seemed to glisten.
"Speak the words aloud, and we shall hear."
Beneath those words, a cryptic poem emerged, seemingly innocent and inconsequential, yet laden with a chilling weight beneath its surface. Michael muttered the words aloud, a whisper of curiosity more than intent. The air shifted immediately. The room grew colder, the light dimming as though the sun had retreated from the window. A faint, hum, like static, filled his ears. Michael shook his head, dismissing the feeling, and tossed the journal aside. But the house had hurt him. The first night. That night, Michael woke up abruptly. The air in the room was thick, oppressive, and carried a sharp metallic tang. He reached for the lamp on the nightstand, but the bulb flickered and died. Then he heard it, a wet, scraping sound like nails raking across damp wood. It came from the walls, moving slowly but with purpose. "Hello?" Michael called, his voice trembling despite himself. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the far corner of the room, a voice rasped. "You spoke." Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. He squinted into the darkness, his eyes adjusting enough just to make out a shape. A hooded figure crouched low, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an inhumane angle. The thing stepped into the faint moonlight streaming through the window, Its skin was stretched taut over jagged bones, its flesh mottled and peeling. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a mass of glistening muscle with deep, empty sockets where eyes should have been.
"You've invited us,"
it hissed. Its mouth split open into a wide smile, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth, each tooth coated in a slick, venom-like substance that dripped onto the floor. Michael screamed, throwing himself backward against the headboard, his foot lashed out instinctively, kicking over the nightstand. The sound startled the thing, which melted into the shadows as though it had never been there. Descent into madness. The following days were a waking nightmare. Blood began seeping from the walls, dark and viscous, pooling on the floor. It had a rancid, metallic scent, and no matter how much Michael scrubbed, it returned stronger than before. The sounds grew louder and more persistent, scratching, whispering, guttural laughter that echoed throughout the halls. And worse still, the shadows began to take shape. At first, they were fleeting, quick movements at the edge of his vision. But soon they lingered, standing motionless in doorways or creeping along the floor. One afternoon, as Michael sat in the living room trying to steady his nerves, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It slithered towards him, its body twisting and elongating in ways that defied nature, until it reared up to stand. The thing bore a vague resemblance to a human, but its proportions were horrifically wrong. Limbs stretched to grotesque lengths, joints bending in unnatural directions, and a head that was unnervingly wide, as if the skull had been shattered and crudely reassembled. Then it smiled, or rather its mouth ripped open, stretched far beyond what was possible, the flesh splitting and tearing until its face was nearly bisected. The jagged, blood-lined grin turned into a frown. Its empty, lidless eyes locked onto Michael with a wickedness that made his blood freeze. Mist began to seep from the floor, curling around the creature's warped body. Within the haze, its shape started to ripple and shift, as though it was shedding its skin to reveal something even worse. A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the air, vibrating the floor beneath Michael's feet. The sound ascended, resonating with the shadow itself. And then it began to speak, its voice a chilling fusion of thousands, each tone layered and discordant, crawling under his skin.
"We have waited for you, Michael. Bearer of the Archangel's name, I am the Lightbringer, and I shall find light for you, whether you desire it or not. You have been chosen, deemed worthy of our illumination. Welcome home."
The words coiled around him, suffocating and burning at the same time. Michael's body screamed in protest, but he summoned every ounce of strength, adrenaline surging through his veins like fire. With a sudden burst of desperation, he scrambled to his feet, heart pounding like a war drum. Without looking back, he bolted down the hall, the grotesque thing's distorted laughter chasing him like a predator stalking its prey. The shadows seemed to twist and reach for him as he ran, their shapes whispering his name, with voices that sounded all too human. Bursting through the front door, Michael didn't stop. He tore down the darkened street, his breath ragged, his mind a storm of terror. A scream ripped from his throat, a primal panic sound that echoed through the silent, suffocating night. The thing's presence still clung to him, as though it had burrowed into his soul, and no distance seemed far enough to escape it. Desperation now drove Michael to the town's small church. The cold wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames as Michael staggered through the darkened streets. His breath came in ragged gasps, the cold biting at his skin, but it was the terror inside that made his pulse race and his body tremble. His mind raced, each thought like a desperate cry for help, a broken plea to escape the nightmare that he had brought upon himself. It was one thing to hear about the stories about demons, about spirits that haunted the living, but it was another thing entirely to feel them clawing at the edges of your sanity. He could feel their presence, their eyes watching him from the shadows, their breath hot against his neck. Each step he took seemed to echo in his ears like the footsteps of something or someone coming closer. By the time he reached the small church, the night seemed to close in around him. The streets were quiet, as if the world itself had fallen silent, holding its breath. The steeple of the church loomed like a dark silhouette against the moonless sky, casting an eerie shadow over the stone walls. He slammed his fist against the wooden door of the church, the sound echoing in the stillness, but there was no response. He hit it again and again, this time harder, his palms slick with sweat. A long, agonizing moment of silence passed before the door creaked open just a sliver. From the darkness beyond, Father Carroll's face appeared, his features grim, his eyes tired, but alert.
Father Carroll, please let me in!"
Michael shouted, his voice crackling with desperation. The church was quiet, save for the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees outside. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of a stagnant incense and the faint must of old wood.
"Michael, my son, what's wrong? What are you doing here at this hour?"
I need your help."
Michael gasped, feeling his legs buckle beneath him. He reached out with trembling hands, barely catching himself on the doorframe.
"They're coming for me. The shadows, I can't escape them. Please, Father, you have to help me."
Father Carroll's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of fear and sorrow. He had seen the signs before, but never in someone he knew so well. Michael was a good man, one of the few in town who kept his faith. But what happened to him? What had he done to summon this? Without a word, the priest stepped aside, pulling Michael into the safety of the church. The smell of incense and old wood filled the air, tainted by the faint, lingering scent of something rotten. It was as though the church itself could feel the evil that had followed Michael here, hanging heavy in the air. Father Carroll led him into a small back room, lit only by the flickering glow of candles. The shadows seemed to dance around them as Michael collapsed onto his knees on the stone ground, his body shaking with the aftershocks of the terror he had just endured. He could still feel them, that thing smiling and clawing at him on the inside, his eyes following his every move.
"Tell me everything, my son,"
Carroll said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of 1,000 confessions.
"Okay, Father, the shadows are speaking to me. Figures are appearing, figures with teeth, and it only happened after I found this old book, a book that I shouldn't have bloody touched. I don't know what I was thinking. It was a dusty, old, worn-out thing hidden beneath the floorboards in the house I'm renovating. It wasn't anything remarkable at first. A leather-bound book, no title, no author, just a strange, faint symbol embossed on the cover of it. And I thought it might have been an old journal or a family heirloom, and then I opened it. And then as I reached the middle of the book, I found something different. A passage written in a language I could somehow understand, though I'd never seen it before. The air around me seemed to pulse when I read it, though I thought little of it. I whispered the words that was in it, that was written down aloud, and was playful at first, mocking the idea. I don't know. I couldn't explain why, but something compelled me to do it. The moment the final symbol left my lips, the temperature in the room changed. It dropped. A draft brushed past my face. I turned around, expecting to see if I left the window open, but nothing was there.
Father Caro didn't interrupt, but Michael could see the priest's expression darken as he continued.
I didn't mean to do it. I swear to God, Father, I didn't mean to. But then I spoke the words, and I didn't realize what it would do.
The priest's eyes narrowed.
What words?
Okay, I said it, like a poem or an incantation. The one from the book, I thought it was, like at the moment I thought it was funny, but it wasn't. It was something else. It went like this. O ancient spirit, dweller in shadow, from the depths where fire and torment grow, hear my call, heed my plea. Through blood and bond I summon thee. By the sigil drawn and sacrifice made, through the veil where light does fade, rise now, infernal power untamed. By this name I call Zazel. Manifest, O force of dread, from realms below where mortals tread. Obey my words, my will, my claim. By pact and right, I bind thy name.
Father Caro sighed deeply, lowered his head as if in prayer.
Michael, you've opened the door to something far beyond your understanding. The words you spoke, they were not simply words. They were a covenant, a pact, a tether to something older than this world.
Okay, so what do I do?
Michael pleaded, his voice desperate now, a broken cry. The priest stood in silence, his expression grim, his gaze distant as if weighing a decision far heavier than Michael could imagine. He was no stranger to evil. He had faced things, witnessed things that should never have existed.
Michael, the only way to rid yourself of this demon is through sacrifice. Blood. Your blood or theirs. But know this. The process is not without consequence. It will draw their attention like nothing else. And know this. A ritual will not just banish them. It will provoke them. They will come after you with everything they have.
Michael's breath caught in his throat.
Sacrifice?
Father Caro nodded, his eyes darkening.
There is no other way to sever the tether. You must make a choice. Offer them blood, or they will take yours in a way that will break you, body and soul.
Michael's mind spun. What was left of him? He had already given up so much. His life, his sanity, his very essence, by speaking those words. What was his blood compared to the terror that was about to fill his every waking moment? But what was he willing to sacrifice? Everything? Was he willing to give up the only one thing that could finally make the pain stop?
Okay, I'll do it. I'll do whatever it takes.
Father Caro moved to a nearby altar, his hands steady as he prepared the ritual. The air in the room thickened, a presence pushing against Michael's chest, pressing down with the weight of everything that had been unleashed. The ritual. The cold stone of the church's floor bit into Michael's knees as he knelt before Father Caro. The dim light of the candles flickered, casting elongated shadows along the ancient walls, their dancing glow painting grotesque images of twisted forms and demonic faces in the far corners of the room. The scent of stale incense hung thick in the air, but there was something else too, something metallic, as if the very atmosphere tasted of blood. Father Caro had been distant, unsettlingly quiet. The old priest had led him to the church's deepest sanctum, a cold, dank room with no windows, only shadows, and a single altar bathed in a sickly green light. Michael had felt an uneasy shiver crawl down his spine as the priest began his preparations, setting down a cracked, blood-stained chalice and opening a thick, leather-bound book Michael had never seen the likes of. The priest's hands trembled as they turned the yellowed old pages, his voice a low murmur, barely audible over the sound of Michael's racing heartbeat.
You have been mocked, but you're not lost. Not yet. We can save you. We can rid you of the demon that now haunts you.
But Michael wasn't sure anymore. The strange, ritualistic words Father Carroll had been muttering under his breath felt wrong, like an ancient chant he had no business knowing. Something didn't sit right. The priest's eyes, dark and sunken, gleamed with an odd fervor, as though he weren't performing an exorcism to save a soul, but to claim it.
Father, this is not what I imagined. I don't like the way this feels.
Carroll's face twisted in something between a sneer and a grin, his eyes narrowing as he slowly closed the book with an audible snap.
You still don't understand, do you? The ritual is not just about banishing what is coming after you, Michael. It's about transferring it.
Michael's heart lurched.
Transferring it? What do you mean, transferring it?
Father Carroll stood suddenly, his robes rustling like the wind in a crypt, and walked to the altar. There he produced a long black knife from beneath the cloth, its blade reflecting the candlelight with a sharp gleam. The air grew thick with the scent of iron as he turned towards Michael.
You see, this demon is beyond powerful. Too powerful for a simple exorcism. It needs to be channeled, redirected. But it simply cannot be cast out. No, it must be offered.
Michael's throat tightened with dread as Carroll reached down and drew a strange symbol in the air above Michael's head with his fingers, one that looked unnervingly like the sigils he had seen in the cursed book. The room felt colder, the shadows darker, pressing in on them both. Michael tried to stand up, but he was frozen in place, his limbs unwilling to respond. He could feel something pulling at him, deep within, a hunger that had been slowly growing since the moment the ritual began.
What do you mean, offered?
Father Carroll leaned in close, his face hovering just inches from Michael's, eyes gleaming with an unnatural light.
You're not just here for salvation, Michael. You're here to make a choice.
With a flick of his wrist, the priest poured a thick, dark liquid from the chalice onto the altar. The liquid shimmered, and Michael realized with a sickening jolt that it was blood. Fresh blood, its coppery scent hanging in the air like a thick fog. The priest muttered more words, low and guttural and foreign, causing the shadows around the room to twist and writhe as though alive. A cold, sinister force filled the room, pressing in on Michael's chest, tightening around his heart. Michael's mind raced. This isn't right. This isn't an exorcism. This is something much worse. His gaze darted around the room, locking on the symbols etched into the walls, symbols that were neither Christian nor demonic, but something older, something darker. They weren't for protection or casting out evil. No, they were meant to summon it. Father Carroll turned towards Michael, his face now bathed in the sickly glow of the candles, and there was something wild in his eyes, something predatory. He slowly raised the knife above his head.
You see, the demon has already claimed you. You are its vessel. But if we act quickly, we can still make use of it. We can harness its power.
Michael's heart slammed against his ribs. Harness its power? What was he talking about? This wasn't a ritual to free him. It was a ritual to control him. Before Michael could respond, Father Carroll's voice rose into a low chant, the words foreign and impossibly ancient. The air around them grew thick with an unnatural pressure, the walls shaking as though the very foundation of the church was being pulled into a void. The shadows began to move again, twisting around them like snakes, hissing and whispering in a language Michael could almost understand now. Join us, come to us, become us. Michael's mind was a chaotic storm of thoughts and confusion. His hands shook, beads of cold sweat running down his neck. No, this is wrong. I need to get out of here.
Father, this is a mistake. Please stop. You're not saving me. You're feeding it. This is all wrong.
Father Carroll's lips curled into a grin that sent a chill straight down Michael's spine.
There's no turning back now, Michael. You spoke the words. You invited them in. Now you are part of this, whether you accept it or not.
The priest raised the knife above his head, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Michael thought he saw a flicker of something other in Carroll's eyes, something not human. In an instant, the shadows in the room merged, swirling around Michael like a storm of dark energy. They pressed into his chest, clawing at his skin, seeping into his veins. It was as if the very essence of the demon was entering him, feeding on his soul. Carroll brought the blade down with terrifying precision, the cold steel slicing across Michael's arm, drawing a deep cut that burned like fire. Blood poured from the wound, pooling on the altar. Michael screamed in agony, but the sound was drowned out by the growing cacophony of the shadows, the voices now deafening in his ears. Michael's heart pounding in his chest, his mind spiraling with panic. The shadows seemed to close in on him, their tendrils wrapping around his limbs like iron chains, pulling at him. His body trembled as Father Carroll's voice grew louder and louder, more distorted, seeping into his very bones.
Embrace this, Michael. Become a vessel. Use the light, the power. Become one with it.
The darkness inside Michael surged, clawing at him, whispering promises of power and eternal strength. But his mind, still clinging to the last vestiges of his humanity, recoiled in horror. No, this cannot be happening. I have to get out. His muscles locked with tension, and with a desperate burst of will, Michael yanked himself away from the altar, pushing through the pressure that threatened to crush him. He stumbled backwards, his legs unsteady, blood dripping from the wound in his arm. Father Carroll's voice reached out for him, but Michael refused to listen, refused to be consumed by this hellish promise.
Michael, come back. You belong with us.
The shadows lashed out, grasping at his ankles, but Michael's panic-fueled adrenaline pushed him forward. His body surged towards the door, his hands shaking as he grabbed the cold handle and wrenched it open. The dim light from the candles flickered behind him, and for a moment, Michael thought he saw the shadows reach toward him, clawing at the air, but he didn't stop. He ran. His footsteps echoed in the silence of the darkened church, frantic and uneven. The pain in his arm pulsed with each stride. Blood was dripping down his arm and into his hand, but he ignored it. The only thing in his mind was escape, and he had to get out. He had to leave this town before it was too late. As he burst into the church's heavy wooden doors, the cold night air hit him like a slap, but it was a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. He gasped for breath, his heart racing, but his legs kept moving, taking him away from Father Carroll's clutches. He didn't stop running. He couldn't. The town was silent, the streets deserted. Michael had no destination in mind. He just needed to get away from that priest, from the shadows, from the darkness that threatened to claim him. His mind screamed at him to run faster, to leave everything behind, but there was a nagging voice in the back of his head, whispering that it was all connected. The house, the priest, the demons. Without even realizing it, his feet carried him back to Elmwood House. He didn't know why. He had sworn he would leave everything behind, but the pull of the house was like a magnetic force, drawing him in. Maybe it was a need to get his things, to sever whatever connection was left to that cursed place, or maybe it was because, despite everything, the house was the only place that felt like home now. The house stood before him like a looming beast, the sharp edges of its silhouette cutting into the black sky. Its windows, once warm with the light of home, now stood like dark, hollow eyes, empty, soulless, and full of something much darker. The once welcoming front door now looked like an unholy gash in the fabric of reality itself, wide open, as though the house was beckoning him to enter. The front door of Elmwood creaked open as he stumbled inside. The familiar darkness greeted him with a cold embrace, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He didn't know if the house had always been this oppressive, or if the demon's influence had begun to seep into its very foundation, but the air felt thick, heavy, with sinister energy. Michael hesitated. He could feel it now, like an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. The house had changed. It had changed. The air around him pulsed with an unnatural heat, and he could hear faint whispers rising from the depths of the house, indecipherable murmurs as though the house itself were alive, breathing, beckoning, speaking to him. He stepped inside, his heart pounding. The door slammed shut behind him with a resounding bang, sending a jolt of panic through his veins. His breath quickened as his eyes darted around the dimly lit entryway, the shadows stretching long and impossibly thin across the walls. The air was thick, cloying, heavy with an almost suffocating presence that seemed to crowd around him, pushing in from all sides. The floorboards beneath his feet groaned as though they were protesting his very presence, and a soft guttural creaking echoed from the hallway. The house was awake. The old place that once felt like home now felt like a tomb, a dark, damp prison. Michael moved quickly, making his way through the house's rapidly decaying halls. His breath came in shallow gasps as he gathered his things, the few personal items that he had unpacked, the photographs of his late wife Clara, and some clothes that he had worn. As he shoved them into a bag, the house seemed to groan in protest, as though the very walls were warning him not to leave. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to grow longer, twisting into shapes that weren't quite human. Michael's skin crawled, but he couldn't stop now. He had to leave. He had to get out before it was too late. But then he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, like the distant murmur of 1,000 voices calling to him. The sound of the house, of the demon that had been lurking there all along. It wasn't in his mind. This was real. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was beckoning him, urging him to come closer. Michael turned. His eyes darted towards the dark hallway. He felt it. Something was waiting for him. The shadows were gathering, thickening, coalescing into a form. And then, from the darkness, sounding like Father Carroll's voice, echoed throughout the house.
Welcome home, Michael.
The voice was a soft, sinister whisper, echoing from the house, or perhaps his own mind, twisting reality around Michael. He stepped back, but the creaking floor warned him to stay. Turning to the door, he found it gone. The house had consumed it. A shadow slithered across the walls, moving like a living predator. No matter where he looked, it stayed just out of sight. Panic set in as the hallway stretched unnaturally, the warped walls dripping with a dark, oozing substance that pooled at his feet. The whispers multiplied into a deafening chorus, speaking of death and torment, invading his mind. Suddenly, Michael realized the truth. The house had always been this way. His grief over Clara had blinded him to its monstrous reality. The walls cracked and writhed, releasing thick, smoky tentacles. The floor split open, revealing an abyss beneath the house. From the darkness, the sound of countless claws scraping stone grew louder, closing in.
You're already ours. We've been waiting for you.
The voices chanted in unison, their tone reverberating through the walls, through Michael's bones, each syllable sinking into his skin like nails. Shadows spilled from the cracks, spreading and twisting into grotesque shapes with clawing arms and gaping, silent screams. Their unearthly eyes bored to Michael as he backed away, heart pounding. The room pulsed like a living beast, walls closing in as darkness thickened, suffocating him. The voices rose to a shrill, bone-rattling crescendo, paralyzing him with panic.
Nobody, please.
And as Michael looked around, his eyes finally landed on the floor beneath him. He saw it, the deep, dark shape that had previously formed from the shadows. A mass of twisting limbs, darkened, broken, and rotting, the remnants of something that had once been human. Its eyes were hollow, empty, but they saw him. It was looking at him. It was reaching for him. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run, but he couldn't. The onslaught. The house began to tremble, its foundations groaning as though the earth beneath it itself were being torn apart. The air grew thick with a suffocating pressure, a weight pressing down on Michael's chest, forcing the breath from his lungs. The shadows in the corner of the room twisted, stretching and rippling as if alive. There was a pulsating, rhythmic thrum, like the beating of 1,000 hearts, or perhaps the sickening thud of something far worse. The floorboards exploded with a deafening crack, and from the jagged hole crawled a grotesque insect-like demon. Its spindly limbs ended in jagged claws that scraped the floor, its oily black skin shimmering with an unnatural sheen. Its face was a gaping maw of serrated teeth, dripping with a congealed black blood-like substance, and it emitted a guttural clicking sound that vibrated through Michael's ribcage. Panicked, Michael unbuckled his hunting knife and slashed at the creature, slicing into one of its limbs. Black ink sprayed from the wound with a hiss, and the demon shrieked, its distorted laughter filling the air. But instead of retreating, it lunged at Michael, its fangs sinking deep into his chest, tearing through flesh and snapping ribs. Michael screamed, staggering backward, and with a desperate burst of strength, ripped the demon away, tearing his own flesh in the process. The creature skittered back, leaving behind a trail of smoking black blood as shadows deepened and closed in around him. But the nightmare was far from over. From the door emerged a hulking monstrosity. Its bloated, rotting flesh pulsated grotesquely. Lesions and oozing sores covered its decaying body, and the air reeked of death so foul Michael gagged and his eyes watered. The creature's face was a twisted parody of humanity, sunken pits for eyes leaking black tar, and a jaw stretched impossibly wide, dripping venom and a jagged, broken-toothed smile. It dragged itself forward, emitted a guttural growl, and when it spoke, maggots and worms dripped from its maw.
Your fear, we smell it. Delicious.
It rasped, its voice a sickening hiss. The demon lunged with unnatural speed, claws tearing into Michael's side. Blood sprayed as the creature's talons sank deep, grazing bone. Michael screamed, slashing his knife into his bloated stomach. The blade sank, but the demon only laughed, its gaping maw revealing serpentine tongues writhing within. It seized his wrist with crushing force, bones cracking under its grip. Michael howled as the demon dragged him closer to its rancid mouth. Suddenly, his stomach burst open, spewing acid bile that drenched him, burned through his clothes and searing his flesh. Agonizing pain consumed him as his skin dissolved, the stench overwhelming. And as Michael writhed, the demon's head snapped forward, jaws stretching wide to engulf him whole.
You cannot escape. You belong to us now.
Michael struggled to breathe, his chest constricted by terror. He tried to move, to fight, but his body felt weak, the pain from his wounds overwhelming. Every muscle screamed in protest as a towering demon stepped towards him. It reached out, its massive clawed hand closing around his throat. The fingers dug deep into his flesh, crushing his windpipe as it lifted him from the floor. Michael gasped, choking for air, but the demon only squeezed harder, its fingers sinking into his skin like long razor blades. Then it tore into his side, its claws raking across his gut with terrifying force. Pain was unbearable, but it didn't stop. The claws dug deeper, tearing into his muscles and organs, shredding him from the inside out. Michael could feel his intestines spilling out, warm and slick in the creature's grip. And as his blood poured onto the floor, Michael realized with a horrifying clarity that he was not going to survive this. He had awakened something that should never have been disturbed, and now it was going to take everything from him. The demon leaned in closer, its breath rancid and hot against his skin.
We are legion, for we are many.
It whispered, its mouth opening wide, impossibly wide, as its teeth sank into his flesh. The final blow. As the demon's mouth closed around him, Michael's vision blurred, the world around him fading. His body was no longer his own, torn, broken, and filled with searing pain. He felt his life slip away, dripping onto the floor in pools of crimson. His last thoughts were fleeting, of Carol, but there was one thing he knew for certain. The tether had not been broken, and in that moment, he became just another piece of the demon's eternal feast. Michael was laying on his back on the floor. The house was silent now. The oppressive presence that had suffocated Michael for days seemed to have been vanquished, but something was wrong. The air hung heavy, suffused with the lingering scent of blood and decay. The once cacophonous whispers had died down to a faint whisper, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for him. A pressure built in his skull, like something was trying to crawl its way out from inside him. He gasped, clutched his head as the sensation overwhelmed him. But then, the sharpest, most unbearable pain exploded through his brain, sharp and searing like fire coursing through his veins. Michael screamed, but his voice felt foreign, swallowed by the darkness that continued to consume him. His eyes rolled back in his head, and for a moment, everything went black. Michael awoke. His breath came in ragged gasps as his senses snapped back into place. He was lying on the ground of the same house that had nearly destroyed him, but it felt different. The weight of the room had shifted, no longer oppressive, but suffocating in a new way. He could feel it, something deep inside him, something wrong. A cold, calculated laugh echoed around him, reverberating off the walls like a distant memory. It was as though the house itself was laughing at him, mocking him. Slowly, Michael pushed himself to his feet, trembling as he stood. The world around him was spinning, but his mind was clear. Too damn clear. He could feel his body pulsing with energy, dark, twisted energy. A gnawing hunger, gnawing at his insides, urging him to move, to act, to feed. As his vision sharpened, Michael saw the first traces of what happened to him. His hands. His skin was no longer pale and human. It had shifted, darkened, his fingertips twisted into claw-like appendages that scraped against the ground. He could see the black veins beneath his skin, pulsing with malicious power. His breath, ragged and deep, carried the scent of death, rotting flesh, decay, and a far deeper, darker stench of sulfuric acid. He glanced down at himself and was met with a grotesque sight. His once pristine clothes were now shredded and drenched in blood, a brutal testament to the horrors he had endured. His rib cage was fully exposed, splintered bones jutting out at unnatural angles with strips of torn flesh dangling grotesquely from the jagged edges. His reflection in the shattered mirror on the wall revealed eyes that were no longer human. His irises had turned blood red, and his pupils were elongated, slit like a predator's. The man who had entered the house, who had been Michael, was now gone. In his place stood something far darker and far more dangerous. A demon. He opened his mouth, tasted the air. The hunger gnawed at him again. It wasn't just a hunger for flesh. It was a hunger for something deeper, something that called to him, beckoning him to leave the confines of the house and hunt them all. The very thought of the priest sent a rush of bloodlust through his veins. This demon, felt the call. He had tasted the darkness of this world and the power that came with it. The last traces of the man he had once been were slipping away, drowned beneath the weight of the demon's will. But the hunger was still there, and it demanded that he seek out Carol. It demanded that he find him and make him pay for what had happened. The house was no longer a prison. It had become a sanctuary. The walls seemed to shift and pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if they were breathing with him, calling him towards his next task. The whispers, once faint, had now turned to a chorus, loud and insistent, urging him forward. With a vicious snarl, Michael, the demon, began to move. His limbs were stronger now, quicker, and with each step he felt himself growing more attuned to the darkness that had consumed him. The house seemed to guide him, the very walls opening up in front of him, leading him towards the exit. But as he stepped into the night, something shifted. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a sickly glow over the land, but Michael's senses were heightened now. Every sound, every movement was amplified. His vision, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the area around him. Every shadow, every rustle in the trees. He was hunting. The wind howled as he moved, carrying the faintest trace of the priest's scent, a mix of incense and something more earthly. Father Carroll was nearby. The demon smiled to himself. It was close. He was close. In the distance, the small church stood, bathed in moonlight. The flickering lights from within revealed movement. The priest, Father Carroll, he was there, waiting. Michael's heart, or what was left of it, burned with rage. He needed to tear this priest apart, to feel his bones crack under his claws, to hear his screams echo into the night. He could almost taste it, the satisfaction of ending what had started in that forsaken house. He stalked the streets like a predator, his movements swift and silent. The church was just ahead. He could feel it now, the pulse of the building, the holy energy that flickered weakly in the air. It was the last barrier between him and the priest. But the closer he got, the more the air seemed to thicken, the weight of the holy ground pressing down on him. He hissed, his sharp teeth gnashing and snapping his anger as he stepped into the hallowed grounds, the very soil beneath him seeming to burn with holy fire. For a moment he faltered. His body recoiled instinctively, the power of the church warring with the demonic forces within him. But the hunger was too strong. It overpowered the fear. He reached the door, and without a moment's hesitation, tore it from its frame with ferocious strength, the wood exploding into a storm of jagged shards that scattered like deadly shrapnel. The sound echoed throughout the small church, but the priest didn't flinch. Carol was waiting. Father Carroll stood at the altar, his back turned, his hands clasped together in prayer. He had known the demon would come, and he had prepared himself. Michael, or what was left of him, growled low in his throat, his claws scraping the floor as he advanced. He was no longer the man that had walked into the house. He was the creature that had emerged from it. The terror of the shadows, the hunger, the rage, it all roared within him as he closed the gap between himself and Father Carroll. The priest didn't turn around. He knew what was coming. Instead, he spoke, his voice calm and steady.
I've been waiting, Michael.
With a deafening roar, Michael lunged at him, claws extended, teeth bared. The priest turned just in time to raise an ancient wooden crucifix between them, the holy symbol glowing with radiant light, attempting to ward off the demon's attack. Michael screamed in fury, his form convulsing as the light seared through him. It burned, but he refused to stop. He had waited too long for this moment. The hunger gnawed at him, relentless, unyielding. Father Carroll's hand trembled. He muttered words of the ancient ritual, the incantations designed to banish evil back into the abyss. The ground beneath Michael's feet trembled as the power of the ritual collided with the darkness inside him. But it was too late. The demon surged forward, crashed against the priest with a deafening force. The two collided, and the walls of the church seemed to shake with the impact. The crucifix was knocked from Carroll's hands as the demon tore at his robes, clawing, raking across his flesh. Father Carroll fought back with every ounce of his strength, but Michael was no longer the man he had once been. The hunger, the rage, and the darkness consumed him entirely. With a final primal roar, Michael's claws sank deep into Carroll's chest, tearing through flesh, bone, and muscle with horrifying ease. The priest's eyes bulged in shock, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and no scream escaped his lips, only a choking, desperate sound as the life poured out of him. The demon's hands clenched into fists, ripping and tearing through the priest's insides. A sickening, wet sound filled the air as Michael wrenched everything from within him, leaving nothing but a mangled, bloody husk. The demon stood over the priest's body, blood and intestines dripping from his claws as he stared down at the lifeless form. His hunger had been satisfied, but there was something else too, a feeling of emptiness. The rage that had driven him was gone, replaced by the unsettling calm. But that calm quickly turned into something darker, a realization that there was no escaping what he had become. Michael gazed down at his blood-soaked, trembling claws, the darkness of his actions seeping deep into his soul. In that moment, the last fragile threads of his humanity unraveled, slipping away into the void, never to return. The demon's lips curled into a twisted, sharp-fanged smile, growling low and deep, his glowing red eyes burning with a cruel, sinister satisfaction.